Today is Friday, April 25th, 2008. This interview is taking place at the Barrier Island Center in Machipongo. I'm Bill Bernart, and my guest this morning is Lowell Wallace, who will share with us some of his stories about Cobb Island and perhaps some of the others. I first learned about Lowell's talents when my kids took karate classes with him right next door at the Machipongo Middle School. And that's got to be more than 30 years ago, I think.
I'm afraid so.
Well, Lowell, thanks for coming down and visiting with us. We want to explore Cobb Island, and I'd like to get started, I think, by just asking you, what were the earliest roots in your family, or what you've been told about that island?
My great-grandfather served over there in the original life-saving station house that was built in 1880. He served over there, I know, in the early 90s in the life-saving service before the Revenue Cutter Service and the life-saving service combined to form the United States Coast Guard. And so he was second in command over there. Captain Jack Andrews was in charge, and he was second in command. So they also had a summer cottage over there where my great-grandmother could go over there and be with him while he was on duty. Otherwise, they lived on Oyster Road. They also had a house on Oyster Road across the street from her family, who were Reynoldses.
All right, and your grandmother's married name was it Wallace?
No, it was Bloxom. We're talking William Floyd Bloxom was his name, and she was Mary Esther Reynolds. That was her maiden name.
Right.
And of course, he had my grandmother. He had all daughters, and she was born Bessie Brown Bloxom, and naturally she went by B. We called her B, and she was born the day after Christmas on Cobb Island in 1893.
And I'm sure there was a doctor in attendance.
Not necessarily.
I don't think so.
Midwives, I would imagine.
Do you remember any stories about physicians being
No,
called to the island for
I'm sorry.
emergencies?
No,
No.
nothing about a doctor.
That's right.
I'm sorry, doctor.
You wonder how they all survived without all the deliveries and the illnesses, the accidents.
Well, you know, they didn't. I did a long stint on Tangier Island. I volunteered for that because, you know, that's the only island community really that's left that isn't causewayed or bridged. And I volunteered for that in the early 80s through the mid 90s. And when you walk through the graveyards, you see a lot of people that die in their 30s.
Yeah.
Appendicitis.
Now that you were working for the telephone company?
Back when it was still the Bell system. They were putting the water in the sewer system down, and I just was that one little Dutch boy that kept his finger in the dike and kept it. Hopefully when the sun went down, everybody could say hello. But, you know, they died until that airstrip was put down over there. A lot of people over there died at a relatively young age. So I would imagine, no, when you're out on those barriers and you know, you come under some distress and some serious medical problems, you just didn't.
Yeah, didn't make it. You mentioned the airstrip on Tangier. Was there any sort of a strip on the Barrier Islands?
Never.
Do you remember?
No, there's never been an airstrip. Now, not even on Wallops now, I wouldn't think. It's all over on the mainland. No airstrips. I remember going to Cobb Island by boat. It would take a good part of an hour to get over there on one of Mr. Terry's oyster boats. That's how we used to go. My first time I stepped foot on Cobb Island was as a Boy Scout. They took our troop 314 Exmoor. They would take us over there in a couple of boatloads, offload us and the equipment, and let us run wild on the island. And I remember they had sand dollars, a lot of sand dollars on Cobb. I don't remember seeing that many on Assateague or Cedar Island and Paramore that I've been on, and jackrabbits. The jackrabbits, they would stand on their haunches, sit on their haunches, and the ears, you know, when they perked them up, were about that tall. Yes, and I don't remember seeing anything else like that on any of the other islands.
You see any mosquitoes?
I don't remember that.
Plenty on
I don't
Hog
remember
Island.
Although we're in Machipunga, and the Algonquin word for that is place of fine sand and mosquitoes. So.
Ah.
But I don't remember that. But they took us over there in the spring of the year. And in the early 60s, they had a bull over there that had a reputation. I can remember the adults having to burn lights at night in the camp to keep him away. But he almost ran us in the surf one day. He was charging us, and you know, we were just about ready to run off the sand dune and go in the surf, and he hesitated and stared at us for a while, and then moseyed on off.
Right. Now, this was a Boy Scout camp. Is that what you're talking about?
The Terrys would take us over. They did that twice.
From Willis Wharf?
Out of Willis's Wharf. And it took a little over an hour to get there. Of course, I wasn't paying attention at the time.
What'd you find there in the way of structures at that time?
Well, at that time, you know, they've since monitored the life-saving station or Coast Guard station over to Oyster. But there was also the one that was the derelict one that was, you know, built in 1880. That was there. Other than that, it was just crepe myrtle and saltgrass, which is probably why that bull was so mean. Oh, he was mean.
Now, you mentioned the monitor, that the barge that brought the Coast Guard station over. Can you tell us anything about that move?
Not really. They did that fairly recently. They did that in the late 90s, didn't they? But, you know, in Oyster Harbor, there used to be 4 or 5 homes on the far side of the harbor that had been monitored over from Cobb Island.
Ah.
And interestingly enough, you know, there's a picture of great-granddaddy on the island, and you see 2-story homes. And now it's a 1 mile wide by about a 5 mile long sand dune. And, you know, that happened in the late 1890s. There were a series of hurricanes that went through that more or less, you know, at that point, it turned a lot of these islands into geological quicksilver. They started walking, and desertification, I guess, set in. And the only thing well, Cedar Island did have a stand of cedars for a while, but now what's over there is dead wood now. They're all gone. So it's gotten to the point, you know, and there was pasture land on Smith Island as well, because Robert E. Lee's wife's family, Custis, had acreage over there and pasture land over there. And he got involved with that when his father-in-law died to settle his affairs just prior to the outbreak of the war between the states.
Do you know if there were any Indian activity on Cobb's Island before Nathan Cobb settled over there?
The only Indian activity on the barriers that I ever remember reading about were the Assateague Indians on Assateague Island. And that was actually the only problem we ever had with Native Americans, because I think in the early part of the 1700s, 18th century, a militia group had to go over there and come to some sort of agreement with them. And that was the only strife that I remember between Europeans and Native Americans, were the Assateagues on Assateague Island.
Tell us, Lowell, how Nathan Cobb arrived on, or why he went to Cobb's Island.
Well, the reason he moved down here was his wife had respiratory problems, had health issues. And his doctor up in Connecticut, I believe, suggested that he move her south to a better climate. And he originally settled in Oyster. He had a general store, I believe, in Oyster. And the business must have been a successful one, because he had the money to, when the opportunity presented itself, to buy what later became known as Cobb's Island. And he put a hotel out there. I understand that there was a dance hall out there and a hotel, in addition to the life-saving station and homes of people that lived over there and worked over there. And that was in operation from just prior to the war between the states until those hurricanes came through in the 1890s.
Right. I'd heard one tale that he paid 100 bags of salt.
I think that's right.
For the island.
He paid for it in salt. Well, you know, salt was one of the reasons, if not the reason, that, you know, the Jamestown settlers became aware of the barriers anyway. You know, on the near Janesville is a place on the Nassaugattas Creek that's still to this day known as Salt Works. And they would take huge kettles over there and boil down the seawater, bag the salt, and take it back to Jamestown. Salt was worth probably more than gold, ounce for ounce, back then, for preserving meats and whatnot. But that's how they initially became aware of those barriers and went over there, was the boiled down salt that I heard. And then later, some land was purchased in 1614 from the Indians, or Native Americans, but they didn't come over and occupy it until 1620. Was when the first Europeans came over here to set up housekeeping. And as time went on, they would put livestock on these barrier islands for the same reason that the scout leaders could cut us loose. That was only so far we could go in either direction. And from what I hear, the old legend tells that Bird's Nest Tavern was frequented at least once by Blackbeard. This has always been a great area for smuggling or sneaking or whatever. Always a great area for doing that. Clean up into Prohibition. But what they could do would make landfall on these barriers and re-victual their ships without really making any human contact. And then they talked some gullible soul into going out there and guarding their livestock. So that's one of the reasons that European settlers started living on those barriers.
You mentioned that there were some homes and the hotel on Cobb's Island. Any evidence that there was a school or a church out there?
Mm-mm. Not that I remember. Not that I remember reading about it.
Mm-hmm.
See, the only thing I have that, other than what was orally transmitted or talked about in the family, was an incident that great-grandfather had while he was on duty in the Coast Guard. He killed 2 men on Cobb Island. And it went to court. And the reason I researched it, because it showed up in the yesteryear section of the Eastern Shore News, and the whole article stopped at the point that he was indicted for murder, but it didn't follow through to say that he was exonerated. And my grandmother and my aunts were ready to sue, and the paper claimed they couldn't find that, and it's in Eastville. But everything else is just word of mouth. But he did kill 2 brothers on Cobb Island.
Sounds like some of the problems we're having today.
Well, they were brothers. They stole a boat in New Jersey, were headed south, and the stations were alerted,
Mm-hmm.
and they overtook them in the area of Cobb Island. He and a man by the name of Zimba were dispatched in a launch, and they beached the boat and were running. I don't know where they thought they were going. Maybe they didn't realize they were on an island. But great-granddaddy called for them to stop, and they didn't. And one was running ahead of the other. And he went down on one knee and fired 1 round. Bullet went through the first brother and killed him instantly, and lodged in the second brother. He died a week later in Cape Charles. And the family brought it into court.
My gracious.
And in the 1970s, I don't know whose wife she was, but on Tazewell Avenue, we called her Old Lady Cobb. And she knew my grandfather and my grandmother, and she brought the whole thing up. And she said, it was your great-grandfather that did that. She had the bolt-action rifle that he used. I held it in my hands. She was in her 90s at the time. She wouldn't sell it. She wouldn't part with it. But he was exonerated and later worked as a deputy sheriff for Northampton County after he retired from the Coast Guard.
Let me take you to a more peaceful area. How about any stories or memories of fishing or the oyster harvest on the island?
Well, of course, the big industry on that island was fishing and birding. They seemed, by today's standards, to shoot anything that would fly. They would have these huge 10 gauge pieces mounted on skiffs, and they would load them with all kinds of scrap metal and stuff. And when they would set those things off, mainly when you catch a flock at rest, they would set those things off, and it would back the skiff up, 2 or 3 yards, the recoil of it, because it was actually we would call a recoilless weapon at the time. But they did a lot of birding. Interestingly enough, I was reading a diary account of McHenry Howard. He was on the staff of the Army, 2nd Corps Army in Northern Virginia during the war between the states. And when the war ended, his family had their reunion on Cobb Island, I guess to get away from the scrutiny of the federal authorities so that they could meet in peace. But it was one of those storms of the 1890s that brought all that to an end. Mm-hmm. And that was quite a story about old man Cobb drowning in the process. That was a young Coast Guard officer. This was after great-granddaddy had retired. And I think this had to do with the 33 storm.
Yeah, this was George Cobb.
Might have been, but see, he initially refused to leave the island. He was sort of like Harry Truman with Mount St. Helens. He refused to leave. And I think the last launch that was pulling away from the dock on the lee side of the island, he had a change of mind and heart and ran down after and the Coast Guard officer in charge refused to turn around and go back and get him. And he was last seen trying to shinny up a pole to stay ahead of the tide. Mm. And that man was transferred up into New England, and from what I hear, a similar incident happened, and he reacted in the same way, and I think it cost him his career. But that was quite a little bit of controversy about him leaving Mr. Cobb on the island.
Mm-mm. Gracious. Speaking of the storms, there was a little Cobb's Island, Cardwell Island. Does that ring a bell? That now is essentially gone, I think. Maybe at low tide there's something left.
There used to be an island off Cape Charles for years during the First World War. There was, I think, Army. It was an Army post of some sort. That's gone. Without a trace.
The islands shift, don't they?
They do. They walk.
They come and they go at the mercy of Mother Nature. Well, how about anything that you know of, or if you had a hand on one of those Cobb carvings, decoys?
Daddy had a few back in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s. I don't know whatever became of those, but they'd be worth a small fortune right now. He shot over them. He used them for what they were intended for.
Yeah, it's amazing what some of these decoys will bring now, the major.
Go to the Ward Museum up in Salisbury, you'll get a good idea of just what they are, just how much they're worth. And
we were given a very large number of decoys about 6 years ago, and had an auction here at the Barrier Island Center, and some of those pieces of wood brought remarkable prices. Amazing talent. And of course we had a number of those carvers on other islands, and certainly Chincoteague had their share with Hancock and Daisy and some others.
And to think of how many of those, decoys, and they were decoys. See, they wanted, like I said, with these huge 10 gauge or more that looked like small cannon, more or less, not shotguns, but they put these decoys out to get these birds to flock right there so that they could discharge those weapons. How many of those got blown to pieces and just floated off as so much driftwood?
Going back to the birds for a second, how about besides killing the birds, the harvesting of the eggs? They were called eggers, I believe.
When I was up here a month or so ago, I mentioned the little outings we used to take. We called them gull egging. And I had to say it 3 times. What? Gull egging. We go gull egging in the spring. And it was never legal. As long as you got an extra dozen for, the authorities when they knew you were coming on the dock. Yeah, they'd get their dozen and all was forgiven and forgotten. Oh, yes. But they were slightly smaller than a small hen egg. They were, now I don't guess you remember, I'm colorblind, but to me they were a beige brown kind of camouflage. The yolk is pink. We deviled them, we scrambled them, we boiled them, we pickled them. We never fried them like a regular egg though. I don't ever remember doing that. And, you know, except for the color and whatnot, it was like any other egg. Only if you pay particular attention, you could detect the slightest aftertaste of fish. But I would not touch one today because of the 2 chicken plants. That's all they want to eat nowadays is chicken scrap. But Daddy used to put us on the shore, and these little ones would be running around, and he would say, 2 or less, you can take it from the nest. 3 or more, you leave it on the shore. Because you had no idea just how far along that egg was. But I can remember going around picking them up. It's like a big Easter egg hunt. On Cobb, we'd go on Cobb. Sometimes off Webb's Island, we'd leave off Webb's. And go gull egging. Was never legal, but that's right for Bob and Betty.
The Nature Conservancy and the Audubon folks would be hard after you. Yeah.
Well, I would hardly say that they're endangered. There's only a blue billion gulls around here. So it didn't seem to harm them any.
Well, we have that wonderful migratory flyway with all the neotropicals going up and down and the other birds, and I'm delighted we have some laws to try to protect them. My only visit to Cobb Island was years ago, and I remember seeing the old life-saving station and of course the Coast Guard station and several peregrine falcons. I don't know whether you were into birds, but that was
I know what hunters they are. I mean, they are fast. They hit hard, and I've often said, you know, if there were such a thing as reincarnation, I had to come back as a bird, it'd be a peregrine falcon. Yes, he's definitely the top of the food chain.
Lowell, can you, with your family's experience of the life-saving station, can you tell us about any of the shipwrecks?
Well, there's one that sticks in my mind. It caused a bit of controversy. You know, the old motto for these people was you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. And great-granddaddy served in the days before the gasoline launches. It was strictly by strength of your arms, your legs, and your back that got you out there. And most of the time you went out when you had absolutely no business being on the water, especially in the type of vessel they went out to you know, try and save the people and salvage whatever they could get off of it. In fact, didn't Nathan run aground? Wasn't that why he ultimately stopped in this area? I think he ran aground himself. But you know, this area of the Atlantic is absolutely speckled with wrecks. But the one thing was, overnight, that a ship went down, all but the last 8 or 10 feet of the top mast. Nobody caught it. And one survivor was holding on for dear life on that mast for at least 2 days. And finally they scanned the horizon and picked him up in the field glasses, went out and got him, and Captain Jack Andrews almost lost his position over that. That was one that fell through the cracks. But they would bring the boats in and make them secure. They couldn't get them off. Then they'd do whatever they could do to offload as much of the cargo and salvage it as they could before the waves broke it apart. You only have so much time before those breakers would tear up a wooden hulled vessel. They just don't last.
How about the rights of salvage? Was there a dispute? Must have been disputes over ownership.
Well, I don't know if it happened up here in Virginia, but I know down around North Carolina they used to set up false beacons to coax people in so they could get the salvage. You got to understand, when you're living out there, you know, for the same reason that McHenry Howard's people met over there after the war, you have a sense of detachment from the authority, and I would imagine all kinds of things went on in my lifetime. I experienced this because Kathy Charnock's father, Kathy Charnock and Arthur Webb's parents, they both lived on Webb's Island. And in 65, well, I'll preface this by saying, I know this because we went over to Webb's and we got Kathy Charnock and brought her home the night he was missing. He came in with a storm brewing, Kathy's father. and said that they had found something on, I believe, Hog Island. And he told his wife, he enlisted the help of Arthur Webb's father, another man, and he told his wife, if I get back with this, we'll never have to work another day in our lives. They went out knowing what they were going out into and perished in the attempt. When they found the boat, the bottom had been marked as though something really heavy had been put in the bottom. And they had gotten it and were trying to get back with it, and I guess the weight was too much and they swamped and they all three drowned. But see, that was always a place for smuggling. Who knows what is in the sand or out in the ocean right now that was tucked away? Pirates, smugglers. I would imagine if we could sit down and see it all, if we could put on this table every shady thing that ever happened over there, it would be a bestseller in no time. In no time. But great-grandfather was a military man. He went out on the water, and I know in later life he was a heavy drinker. The family Bible said he died of Bright's disease. Now, doctor, what did they call Bright's back then?
Well, it was a kidney disease.
I'm not surprised. Yeah. Okay, makes sense. But Mother tells when he lived, after he was retired, living in Oyster, my great-grandmother was in the right smack dab in the middle of hosting a temperance meeting, and Mama said she heard a noise in the front yard. They had urns on either side of the sidewalk, and he had knocked one over. And quite luckily, they had a set of stairs that were out of sight of these ladies holding the temperance meeting, and she's trying to wrestle a drunk grandfather up the steps to keep him from being caught at the temperance meeting. Is going on downstairs, and he's upstairs loaded to the gills, Mother said. Put his nightcap and his nightgown on him. He slept with a nightcap and put him to bed. And he called her Squinchy. That was her name, Squinch.
Oh, well, let me take you from Squinchy to the lighthouses. Now, there was a lighthouse on Assateague. There was one still is, on Smith Island. Mm-hmm. Do you remember any stories about the lighthouse keepers or their problems?
I think on Smith, or was it Hog Island, they had one really bad storm where the Brant, for some reason or another, just collected around the lighthouse, I guess a sort of source of light. And when the storm was over, there were scores of dead Brant and whatnot all around the lighthouse. But they hunted Brant a lot. What do we call these piping plovers? These small shorebirds? They would hunt those.
Endangered birds.
Yes,
this
but
big.
Back then, everything that everything that didn't bite you back, they ate. I can remember grandmother talking about becoming deathly ill from eating mannows. I guess other people call them razor clams, but great-granddaddy used to collect them and dice them up and I guess make fritters out of them. And she said they made, when she found out what they were, I guess it just made her ill. Daddy was a hunter, and he would hide a lot of things in brown gravy and onions. I had muskrat one time thinking I was eating squirrel. He sat back and got that twinkle in his eye and said, "How'd you like the squirrel, son?" I said, "Daddy, what was that?" Because I noticed the meat was a little on the dark side. "What was that?" He was, "Muskrat." I went, "Oh, my Lord have mercy." My stomach went, "Nyeh," but I kept it. But Daddy would do a lot of that. He deer hunted regularly when there was absolutely no season in Northampton County. Got 2 a year. First year they made it legal, he quit.
Any deer on the island or strictly?
They would swim over. I've seen deer tracks on Cobb. I've seen coons on Cobb. Evidently they're good swimmers because I have seen signs of the deer, but I actually saw one drowned coon on Cobb and whatnot. But I guess it would be based on what I've read. At one time, I guess these islands look more like Assateague with woods and the habitats, that could sustain like the squirrels. There's a particular black squirrel that lives on Assateague that I don't know if it's found anywhere else. And Smith, I know, was able to support cattle and sheep at one time for the Custis family. But I've never heard anybody talk about, in my family, doing anything but, birding and fishing.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else over there, as far as I ever remember, except for those jackrabbits.
Let's go down to below Cobb's Island and tell me what you remember about Skidmore or Mockhorn.
Well, Mockhorn, this is right out of a novel, it seems like, on great-grandmother's side of the family, lived on Mockhorn, and they would pass, they called it, my mother used to tease my grandmother, you can't leave the country. Why? Because you can't get a passport. Why? Because your birthplace is about 200 yards in the Atlantic. And it is, or was. Yeah, they walk. And remember when Cedar Island was being developed, all the controversy and ink that was spilled in the Eastern Shore News about whether it should or should not be done. Those homes were built over there. No sooner did they get established over there. I think when they were built, they were about 150 yards from the beach. Now high tide goes under them. Soon as they got established over there, I knew, being a local, that Cedar Island was going to have the last word. And so did a lot of people. Locals would go over there with nothing more substantial than plywood and 2x4s and build a cottage. Kept the rain off of them. The sea took it. They just go over with more plywood and more 2x4s and build another one. But these were homes, substantial homes. And it was eerie. One of them that, it's right there on the water's edge now. High tide goes under it because it's on stilts. But the people had no recourse. It's about a 2.5 mile walk from the dock on the lee side of Cedar Island. But it was abandoned. Perfectly good washer and dryer, ceiling fans, pictures on the wall. A room like this. And silverware in the drawers. They just walked away, locked the door, and wrote it off on the insurance. Had no other recourse but to do that. So, the islands will have the last word. But isn't it interesting that in the 30s, during the Depression, part of Roosevelt's make-work projects, everywhere a Coast Guard station was placed in the 30s is still to this very day, if you're going to put a structure up, whether it be cedar, Assateague, or whatever, the best place to have a structure on that island. I don't ever remember from Assateague on down hearing of a 30s era Coast Guard station that was built of cedar and whatever other materials they used washing away. They're all still there, unless they've been torn down and moved. So those men knew exactly what they were doing when they placed those structures there. Even the one on Cobb Island that was built in 1880 it's fallen down, but it's still on land. The ocean didn't claim that.
Now the one on Cobb's Island resides near Oyster.
It's on the other side of Oyster Harbor.
I know the Conservancy, I think, has sold that, haven't they?
Initially when they brought it over, they were going to have a restaurant there.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that was
conference center. It's beautiful, beautiful restoration, but I believe they've either sold it or in the process of.
But great granddaddy never. He was already retired. He died. He died in 1938. They buried him on Christmas Eve, 1938. So he had already retired by the 30s, when those new stations were built.
Right, and his name again?
William Floyd Bloxom.
Right.
Billy. We called him Pop Bloxom.
And he was in the life-saving.
He was life-saving service.
And then did he become a member of the Coast Guard when they combined? He
was still on active duty when they made the transition, when the two consolidated, the Revenue Cutter Service and the life-saving service. And I think the Coast Guard symbol is a combination of the two. But at any rate, my cousins went in the Coast Guard. I made up my mind I was going to go in the Coast Guard. And I went into Salisbury and talked 2 friends into going in with me. We got all the paperwork done, everything. And I can remember there was this contract doctor in Salisbury, country doctor, under contract to give physicals. And the 2 others had gone and gotten on the bus, and they were waiting for me to get on the bus to go to boot. Had my hand on the doorknob, going out of the office, and he, wait a minute, come back, forgot one thing. Tested me for color blindness and sent me home. I can remember walking out, seeing the faces of Jimmy Payne, who recently died, and come on, we're waiting for you. I said, I'm not going. What do you mean you're not going? I said, they won't take me. Why? Well, it's because I'm colorblind. They won't take me. So I think it was a good 20 years, and I'd run into these boys that they would use my proper name. I think the first time they ever used this was hollering out the window, USOB. So I couldn't help it. I just, I was red, green, and pastel colorblind. And red and green is what they really, really need you to see. But on the other hand, doctor, I retired from the Bell system. And I did a lot of troubleshooting for everything, cable on down. But my title was cable splicing technician. I retired from the phone company, a colorblind cable splicer. I can remember when I did splice, and they knew it. There were 2 other people working out of an Hancock that were called Bryce Davis and J.D. Turner. They were called, I used to go behind them and correct them.
Lowell, tell me now, when did you retire from the telephone service?
February of 1999.
99.
I had it for a little over 30 years.
And your family now, can you tell me about your family?
Well, all of my sons live on the shore. They live in Accomack County. I lost one son in 93. In 91, he had a car accident, rolled it, no seatbelt. Teenagers think, as I did, they're immortal. And there was a lot of damage to the brainstem, was in a coma. Gave him a 1 in 10 chance of coming out of the coma, and he did. But his speech was slurred. He had to walk with a walker. It was like he'd had a stroke. And he started developing seizures, and one night in July of 93, sitting on the couch watching Saturday Night Live, he had the last one. But Lowell Jr. lives in Anancock. I live in Anancock. Sean lives in Only. And Jeremy lives in Parksley. He's working in phone company cable and whatnot. He's the only one that deals with cable and wires.
Right.
The way
Is he colorblind?
No, see, oddly enough, I can't pass it on. You know this. Only your mother can pass it on. You put and women represent about 1/10 of the colorblind population. It's rare in women, but they're the carriers. You can only get it maternally. So I couldn't pass that on to them.
How many grandchildren do you have?
3. I have a granddaughter, 13, Megan. Gracie is 7. And Connor, Sean's first and probably only. They were talking about his second child, but Connor's probably convinced him otherwise. He'll be 2 in June. So he's the only Wallace male that's going to go into it.
Lowell, you're a very well-read gentleman. What have you been doing with your retirement? Have you done any writing?
No.
Have you thought about writing about the history of the shore?
You're not the first person to suggest that. I don't know why I don't write. I don't know. I do a lot of reading. Somebody once said a person that won't read is no better off than a person that can't. But my interest has been very narrow. I came along in time to know both of my great-grandmothers, and their fathers were Confederate soldiers. Mom Bloxom didn't say much of anything to me at all about it, but great-grandmother Gladden, she was considered fairly dangerous by the rest of the family. I used to have to sneak to go visit her because they all lived in one home back then, and she would always tell me about her father. And, looking back on it, it was so fresh with her, you could almost smell burnt gunpowder when she talked to you. So by the time I went into the first grade, I was more or less indoctrinated. I was a states' rights advocate. I was a card-carrying Confederate. And she never, ever mention anything socially about the causes. It was all about the Constitution and invasion of our constitutional rights. When the Lincoln administration demanded a quota from us and said, oh, by the way, we're going to march through your territory to attack South Carolina, Virginia had two choices: either aid in that, which was a travesty to the Constitution, or join South Carolina in defending our rights. And that's, I can't speak for the other 10 states, but that's why Virginia did it. And that's how I was brought up. Powder horns from the War of 1812 hanging on the wall, and such as that.
Now, the Union troops did occupy Chincoteague. And
they didn't have to.
Well
Chincoteague seceded from the Commonwealth for all intents and purposes, then made a separate agreement with the northern authorities. One man voted to go with the Confederacy, and he had to leave the island. Because you see, all their markets were in New York. On the Bay side, most of the markets were Norfolk and Baltimore. Well, Baltimore was a hotbed of secessionist sympathy. Federal Hill in Baltimore is called Federal Hill to this day because the Yankees had to line that place with cannon and threaten to blow Baltimore to pieces if they didn't pay. So Chincoteague was more or less Unionist because of their pocketbooks.
Right. And Grandma Gladden could certainly tell you stories about the folks that crossed the waters and joined the Confederacy.
We'll see Pop Bloxom, Ezekiel Bloxom, he stayed behind, took the oath, and went home. Henry Culna, we'll spell Culana, but folks in Churton pronounce it Culna. He refugeed across the bay, joined the 19th Virginia Battalion of Heavy Artillery, and served as part of the Richmond garrison for the rest of the war. I think Custis Lee, Robert E. Lee's oldest son, took his place as liaison between the civil and military authorities. And just prior to Richmond being evacuated, he was given an ad hoc division of naval personnel, the heavies, they called them, heavy artillery, and they made a division. And all it ever got to do was evacuate Richmond and make the march to Appomattox. But I have evidently great-great-granddaddy found a way to slip away, because I don't find him on the rolls of the paroled soldiers.
Right.
He was unreconstructed Confederate.
And Robert E. Lee, as I remember, was here briefly on Hog Island.
He was on Smith. The Custis family owned land on Smith in lower Northampton County. And Daniel Park Custis, I think, in his will, wanted the slaves to be manumitted. And he was in the process of going through the legalities of that. And even during then, he was criticized for not doing it fast enough, when it was the government that was holding him up in the first place. Yeah. The old rock and hard place.
Lowell, thank you.
You're welcome, Doc.
I'm afraid our time is up, unfortunately. Thanks for coming in and
Well,
sharing
I was
all these
concerned it would be too much time.
Wonderful stories with us. I appreciate it.
Well, you're very welcome.
Fun to talk with somebody I've known way back the early years. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.